Evening. I'm just going to do the parish minutes. Adrian is going to introduce our speaker, and then we'll be on the road. Okay. Next talk is Mark Highway. You might have come across his Second World War talks previously. He's talking on the RAF Needs or Point, a story rarely told. That's next month's talk. The half-term children's activity are all about the Herd, which is an amazing project. It's an international project. You might remember the giant puppet refugee child that walked across Europe. It's related to that project, and we're running activities, puppet making, wildlife walks, environmental activities, all through half-term at the Museum for Children, and you book online. But I think they're all free. It's the last week of our VE Day window, so if you haven't had a quick look, please have a look. Next window will be on the hospital, so that should be interesting. And the current exhibition by David Abraham is astounding. The photographs have to be seen to be believed. They're more like abstract works of art than photographs, so if you haven't seen that, we'd love to see you. And I'm plugging my quiz. I'm running one of the fish and chip quizzes, but without the fish and chips next week on Thursday. Yes, fish and chips just got too difficult these days. The price just keeps going up and up. So we're doing it. It's quite small. So if you're interested, the numbers are limited. And again, you can book online. Everything's gone digital these days. Some of you might have seen the notice that went around about coffee and cake in the museum. We are going to open from normal closing time 4 till 6:30 for the next 3 summer talks. So we will try and send out reminders a bit sooner, but we thought it's such a great facility and some of you might enjoy it. So we will be trialing that for the next 3 summer talks. And finally, it's the 750th anniversary of St Thomas's this year, and we're putting together an exhibition for them in the church, and also we're building on our own collection at the museum. One thing we're really short of are social photographs, mother and baby groups, christenings, weddings, sort of, with people in. Sort of, and don't think that, it's in the 70s, that's not old enough. It's over 50 years ago. We need those sort of images now. Unfortunately, we are the history these days. And so if you've got anything like that, Freya at the back there would love to hear from you. We take digital images. We don't have to take your precious photos. We will take scans of them. But if you've got anything, we would love to hear from you. Fates, all that kind of thing. Carol services. Yeah, we'd love to hear from you. Right, I'm going to hand over to Adrian, because I don't know about you, but my brain gets really scrambled when I start reading about the Quiberon expedition, and I'm really hoping you're going to untangle me. Adrian.
Thanks, Jackie. Well, the very fact that so many people here tonight shows how there's a fascination in Lymington for this brief moment when the town had its place on the world stage. And I suspect many of you in the audience have been to Quiberon, and that may well inform your questions at the end. It's been, about 3 or 4 years. We've been very aware of the anniversary creeping up and had various ideas for how we would mark that anniversary. So, to give 2 examples, neither of which reached fruition. One was to actually make a film on Quiberon, and I set out with a friend to do that, and we realised very quickly our limitations, so abandoned that one. And another one was a virtual tour of the top floor of the museum in Quiberon, where there is a permanent exhibition devoted to the expedition, and where you can see engravings of the main characters and engravings of Lymington, where the French emigres were. But if you've been to the museum in Quiberon, you would know why it would not have worked out well, really. Sadly, it's a very modest affair by comparison with St. Barb's. So we had to abandon that one. So we came back to having a talk, and it became clear very quickly that there was only one person that we could approach and know that that person would speak with knowledge and authority, and that was Alistair Nichols. Alistair is a retired police officer who has impressive depth of knowledge with regards to foreign forces that served under the umbrella of the British Army in the course of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 20th century. And he's written several articles on the subject, and indeed he's written 4 books, one of which is dedicated to the Quiberon expedition, and I'm sure he will talk about the book, and we must give it a heavy plug at the end of tonight's lecture. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Alistair, confident in the knowledge that if there's one person in Britain who has an encyclopedic knowledge of the Quiberon expedition, we're about to hear from him. Thank you.
Hi. Started off as the 3rd best option, and then it sort of came up higher. Well, thanks for coming out tonight. Lovely evening. Hopefully I can keep you amused and interested for the next however long it is. But please, if we're coming to the end, please remind me. Health warning, first off. Whatever I am or was or whatever, I'm not a linguist. So if I pronounce certain words or names in certain ways that you don't like, sorry. It's not deliberately to irritate you. This week I've been working in France, and the director of the project, Isabel, she pulls this certain face when I say a French name or whatever in a certain way. And I just look at her and say, Isabel, you're pulling that face again. So anyway, that's how it goes. Right, so from the 10th of June, 1795, almost 230 years ago, French soldiers began to embark at Lymington for an armed landing in their homeland. They were there to take part in what was called the Quiberon expedition. I think there's a bit of a spoiler alert. Well, we all know it didn't really end up very well in the end. So we can sort of skip that bit. That's done. So why I came to sort of take an interest or study in it, as has already been said, I've sort of had an interest in the foreign regiments in the British Army. And originally I stuck to sort of Napoleonic period, and then gradually through friends and other things I got dragged towards the Revolutionary Wars, which are a little bit messier, not necessarily in blood terms, but in politics. But hence I ended up that way. And what I kept on coming across were very sort of brief mentions about the Quiberon expedition, which to me didn't really make sense. That this was an Anglo-emigre invasion of Brittany, but there were only, well, initially there were little more than 3,500 men, hardly an invasion force. That they landed in Quiberon, on the Quiberon Peninsula and got trapped there. Well, it didn't really make sense why they landed in Quiberon Peninsula if that's what they're going to do. And also there was the little sort of whiff of perfidious Albion only set this up to kill all the French naval officers who had done so well during the American War of Independence. Bit of an expensive and long-winded and inefficient way to do it. But that's still a myth that still today floats around. So to start off, for those of us who like to know where we're going, Quiberon Peninsula. One point is quite important is to say right at the far end of Brittany there is a place called Brest, which is the most important Atlantic naval seaport for the French Navy. That was quite important for that one. Well, at this stage, France is a republic, and the revolution having started about 6 years before, and the sort of process of the political, structural, religious and societal changes ended up with international war, emigration and internal conflict. So Britain had been sort of dragged into the war through a defensive alliance with the Netherlands. But by this time, by 1795, there was only really Britain and Austria still at war. Most of the other countries, led by Prussia, had started making peace with France. So there was a big question as how Britain's going to continue with the war. And in France, there was a lot of civil war and civil conflict going on. In actual fact, a French sort of friend of mine actually described it that actually, if you want to understand what France was like in about 1793-94, think back to what Syria was like a few years back, with lots of different groups fighting each other and fighting for power. It wasn't just the political infighting that took place in Paris. There was a lot more going on. And in particular, that was in Western France, in Brittany, where there tended to be localized small insurrections, often led by priests, and that was more a reflection or an action against local events in terms, in particular, about the religion being attacked and the change in land ownership. In the Vendée, sort of further down, sorry, I can't point there, on the coast there, and south of the Loire, it was much greater war. It was really a large-scale insurrection with really bloody repression by the French regime, particularly once Robespierre was in the chair, such that one French historian rather upset or put the cat among the pigeons by describing it as the French genocide, the government's reaction. But that mainly was actually against conscription. So one of the answers, particularly as Britain was really short of men, and their military certainly had been cut back so much after the American War of Independence, was to try and get emigre troops. And there was a special act of Parliament by which emigre troops were employed and recruited by Britain. And this particular regiment is the Regiment d'Ively, which took part in the Quiberon expedition. One of the key things that they made them different was that they wore the white French royal cockade rather than the British black, hence they're called white cockade regiments. So these were to take part in these three regiments took part in the Quiberon expedition. Three of them are very different. They all had different connections. The one of Hector was all called the Royal Marine, Royal Navy. They were largely made up of Royal Navy officers, French Royal Navy officers, and they were actually here. And they are the ones who embarked at Lymington. Overley was at Lyndhurst. That was their depot. And the last regiment was du Dresnay. And du Dresnay were largely Breton officers and soldiers. Where did they get the soldiers from? There were plenty of officers who were the emigres. The pay was comparatively good for them, and it was another opportunity to live in a time when France was not available to them, and they were struggling to keep their families, as well as seek to further the Royalist cause. The soldiers who were available were the ones in the prisoners of war camps or depots, as they were called then, in Britain, in particular Portchester and in London, Chatham and places like that. It's often portrayed as being a mistake to enrol prisoners of war, and B, that they were done by force, but it was strictly voluntary. In actual fact, there's French officers who were in charge of the recruiting, and they're saying how convoluted it was to try and get these men to join. But also, it was actually in the Act of Parliament that they would recruit prisoners as well, so it was foreseen from the start. And in actual fact, it was a very common practice in all armies of the time to actually try and get prisoners of war to enrol into your own army. After all, it's cheaper. But of course, there's always that reliability question. But in actual fact, the French officers who were in charge of these men, one of their main problems was not that they were ex-prisoners, but most of the prisoners of war in Britain's depots were sailors. And that was their problem. As one put them, and it's my translation, so I apologise again. However, it must be said that the Regiment de Villiers, sorry. Here we are. There were many sailors, a type of men, very difficult to train to drills and manoeuvres. And that was his opinion. Right. If anyone's got any questions or at this point, just please.
Who was paying for them?
Britain.
The government?
Britain.
The British government?
British government were paying them, yeah.
And they were the people who ran away from the revolution?
The emigres were all driven away. Because there was during the revolution, there was a policy to change the army, which was one of the pillars of the monarchy. And so they wanted to get rid of the noble officers, essentially. I mean, you could spend a long time talking about it, but it was a deliberate policy to change, to attack the pillars of the monarchy, which was the church, the nobility, and the armed forces. And it made sense because the French monarchy system was almost like a family firm where the nobles were part of the whole system. So you had to so if you were trying to change your country, you're going to change that. And a lot of the officers were attacked by their men, killed, murdered, or driven off as well. It wasn't just a political decision by them, it was also a matter of life and death, literally.
Also, just say what the objective of that expedition was, because presumably 3,000 men...
Yeah, I'll come to it. If you know it, yeah. No, that's right. No, it's fine. Absolutely. Good question. That's why I told you. Go on.
Were the sailors Royalists or Republicans?
Both. They were seen as good, like there was some good Bretons, very religious, etc. But there were some others, yeah. And there's a lovely story of some chap on a coach travelling to Southampton, and he was very upset because these new recruits were singing Republican songs. The fact that the writer of this letter was called himself the True Briton may be a reason why they sang the songs as well. It's always good to wind people up a little bit sometimes, isn't it? Right, if you just I'll carry on then. At 1 p.m. on the 12th of June, the naval commander of the ships, Captain Sir John Borlas Warren, gave the signal to sail to 38 transports, And at 6 p.m. they passed the Needles, and other ships joined, including the ones with the soldiers from Lymington, joined the convoy as they went along the channel. And they were joined by further frigates off Plymouth Sound, and including a Breton Royalist vessel called a chasse-marée, which is a particularly fast-sailing ship that was good for, or vessel, good for coastal transport in the days before refrigeration, particularly for pilchards. And they became more and more important. There was a large fleet of these chasse-marées that operated as tenders and supported the Navy throughout. And you're talking about 100, 200 of these vessels by the end. So it was a big operation. In addition to the transports and warships and carrying the troops, there were store ships. And to give an idea of quite the size of it, there was food, there were 100 horses, there were uniforms for almost 18,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry. 27,000 muskets and bayonets, as well as 10 artillery pieces, 600 barrels of gunpowder, along with saddles, boots, shoes, sabres, entrenching tools. So it was a big, big operation, and there was a big investment made by the government in this. As I said, there were 3 of these émigré regiments. What I should have said was the 2 other regiments embarked at Southampton on transports, and the regiment, the Hector regiment that embarked at Lymington, actually embarked on warships, which the French naval officers who in command of this regiment were very pleased, because they saw it as the Royal Navy paying them a compliment. But there was a plan, as I said, there wasn't many, so there was a plan also for another group of émigrés to join them from Germany. However, the transports that were to take them arrived too late. And this is really a part of the British government's sort of lack of good management and good planning. There was a lot of wishful thinking in the British government at that time. Sometimes probably is other times as well. But certainly at that time, there was a great deal. And they often thought that a regiment or a ship could be in 2 places at the same time. So this 2nd Division actually only sailed from the Elbe on the 29th of June. And it's a very small, well, it says 2nd Division. There were 5 very under-strength light infantry battalions with 81 officers and only 1,081 men. But we'll come to them later. Oh, sorry, that was a Borlas, Warren, for you. And that is one of the Damask Legion was part of the 2nd Division. They had originally been in Dutch service, hence the orange cockade on the hat. There were 2 commanders, or 2 senior officers, French senior officers, in the 1st Division. One, I won't even try the whole thing, Louis-Charles de Villy. He was a professional soldier, obviously colonel of the largest and most complete of the regiments that sailed to Quiberon. He's often portrayed as being very rigid, uncompromising, difficult, maybe. However, he had been a very, very loyal officer to the king. In actual fact, he almost stayed to the last moment to serve Louis. And as a result, because of the progress of the revolution, he'd actually served under what was called the constitutional monarchy, which for the hardcore émigrés was a no-no. So hence when he emigrated and had to leave France, he actually directly came to England and served with the British Army at that stage. Part of the reason that he gets a bad rap really in his descriptions was the memoirs of the other French commander, Joseph de Puissy. If I'd spend a little time on him, because he has a very wealthy nobleman background. He was in the assembly, French assembly, during the Revolution. He was quite, went along quite happily until he sort of lost his place in the assembly. And then he sided with what history was to be the wrong side. When the Girondins and the Jacobins were fighting for control, basically for the centralisation of power in Paris or a more federal France. So obviously anyone who studies France until even the last couple of decades know that actually the Paris centre won. As a result of that, Puissy ended up having to escape and take refuge in Brittany. He had no real military experience. The only military experience he had was as a ceremonial officer in the French court. As one of his friends, who later fell out with him, described him as a tall, imposing figure. But he wrote, a few men were really more persuasive than him, but he had too much self-esteem to believe that a good idea could emerge from any other head than his own, and too much insensibility to cede to opinion. Once he got to Brittany, he fairly quickly established himself as a leader of some Chouans. The Chouans is a name for the Breton insurrectionists. The story is that it comes from the call that was used by smugglers, Breton smugglers, as like an owl, a screech owl. But he set himself up as a leader among the Chouans and quickly developed a network. And he worked hard to try and make that network greater and more powerful and more significant. At the same time, he was sort of coming up with different schemes to try and improve his position, whether it was through contacts with the French princes who were in exile, but also with the British government, because he saw the British government was keen to support some of these insurrections, and so there could be a source of power in terms of money, but also of men. So as a result, in September 1794, he travelled to London. And it was tough going, because every time he got in a boat, he was seasick. Now, he came along describing himself and as a leader of a insurrection that was in action, that he had thousands of men ready to follow him and take part in any action against the Republican forces. At times, he did have sizable numbers, but nothing like the numbers that he would boast about. However, the British government were really keen to listen to what he's got to say, because they were desperate for some horse to back, really, and he seemed like a man that's got something to put back up with. He'd only intended to be away from France for a few months. And unfortunately for him, and for the story actually, of the expedition, he was away for a lot longer. But also, at that time, France was changing. Robespierre was out of the scene. His head had gone away from his shoulders. And so the previous policies of trying to deal with insurrection and political opposition by violence and brutality, and it was literally a decided policy of that's how they were going to behave. There was more of what we'd call a hearts and minds strategy to dealing with the insurrections in the West. And in particular to separate the hardcore Chouans or Vendéans from Vendée and the leaders from their followers. So there was less action against priests to bring people on side that way, and lots of other uses of amnesties and that sort of thing. So gradually, while Puissé was away, his network was becoming under increasing pressure. And one of the important people that appeared about the time was the French commander, Louis-Lazare Hoche, a young general who's only 26 by this time, who'd risen up very rapidly, gained political enemies in doing so, and it was only Robespierre's fall that prevented him being on the guillotine himself. So by that stage, the Vendéan rebels had agreed peace, and Brittany was close to agreeing as well. So Puissé was getting more and more anxious to try and get the British government, to do something and land. And what he was pushing them to do was land in the north of Brittany, because it was closer to Puissé's own sort of source and network. But what he was in it come out with more and more impressive numbers of men, but also we really got to land here, really got to get equipment to my men, and British troops to support it and support the landing of the equipment, that is. However, when the naval officers, including French officers who knew that the coast, said actually the north coast is not the place to go. So unfortunately for Puissé, they decided to go for Quiberon Bay. Quiberon Bay was very, very familiar for the British Navy. They fought and operated in that area for many, many years, including during the 7 Years' War, when Belle-Île itself was occupied by the British and was only handed back after the treaty. I say unfortunately for Puissé because the Chouans of Morbihan, which is now the department in that area, there was an element of nobility in there. They had local leaders, in particular one called Georges Cadoudal, who has even now a mausoleum at Auray in the town there. But also they had always opposed Puissé's movement of a greater network. They wanted to be independent and wanted to work in their own way. There was also something else that Puissé wasn't particularly happy about, and that was the way that the operational command was separated and divided by the British government. In short, Hervely was in command because of the troops right up until the landing was made. And only once the landing was made, Puissé then became the commander-in-chief. Effectively, only Warren and Hervely could say, A, whether a landing was going to take place, and B, where it was going to be. It's quite controversial, and quite a few French historians over the many years, have made a big deal of this. But in the end, it was actually playing to what the individuals, their knowledge was, their expertise. But also, once they're on land, Puissé's got enough to get on with, because he will be organising the shoah, making sure they're equipped, etc. Has anyone got any questions at this stage? Just to...
Were the Huguenots involved in all this?
The Huguenot was a religious issue of many years before. Yeah. Yeah, it's quite a long time ago, long time before. Yeah, I mean, in actual fact, one of Louis's last actions prior to the revolution was actually to ease the actions against Protestants in France, which is one of the reasons why some of the ultra monarchists weren't particularly happy with him. Okay, shall I carry on? Yep. Okay, so one of the problems was that the convoy to get to Quiberon, or Quiberon Bay, should I say, was they had to sail past Brest. And cutting a long story short, it was a bad time to, because unbeknownst to the planners, if anyone was actually planning that, the naval expedition, there was a French fleet at sea. And what's more, it was off Belle-Île. Luckily, and it was pretty much luck as well, the Channel fleet that had accompanied the convoy, or had met with the convoy while it was at sea, went round Brest with them. And then the Channel fleet stayed off Brest while the convoy carried on towards Quiberon. It was only when the leading frigate, Warren's leading frigate, spotted the French ships did the Channel fleet be informed and took some action. That action ended up with the French fleet being chased into Lorient, so just to the west of Quiberon, and that's where they stayed throughout the expedition. Unbeknownst to the British, those ships were not in a condition to interfere, but it was always a lingering threat to any of the operations in Quiberon Bay. In fact, a lot of the French crews were discharged. Most of them were Bretons, so some ended up serving with the Republicans, some actually ended up joining the shoah. As the ships under Warren gradually came into Quiberon Bay on the 25th of June, they sailed into a thick fog. So they actually had to sound their way into the bay and then wait for pilots to join them. Under Puissé's memoirs, etc., make a great deal that Overley took a long time making up his mind where they were going to land, etc. However, if you actually look at the ship's logs for some of the British ships, that shows that that was a complete falsehood. That there was, and indeed Warren also, his own account shows that as well. Overley did a reconnaissance, they made the decision where and when they were going to land, and then they started the complex planning for the landing. And it was on the beaches near Carnac that they landed, at Le Jeunesse and Saint-Colombin, and they landed on the 27th of June. Although it was quite small scale, it's got to be said that actually this landing was absolute textbook. And in actual fact, it shows the cooperation between the French emigre officers and the British naval officers was much, much better than the British Army and the British Navy for decades. I mean, up until Egypt in 1801, practically every other attempt to landing was, well, didn't go well. Yeah, I think a lot of people would describe it worse than a mess up. So what happened was they were led by the Loyal Emigrants, which was another of the emigre regiments, and then Overley's battalions, 2 battalions, landed with artillery. And why these particular beaches were good for a landing was that they're almost like little coves with rocky outcrops on either side, which meant as soon as you secured those rocky outcrops, you couldn't be outflanked. The landings couldn't be attacked on the flank. As the emigre, or the boats carrying the emigre troops approached the shores, there was Republican troops were there, and they did make an attempt to try and interfere with it. However, Overley actually led almost a feint and then enabled the landing to go ahead that way. While they were doing that, a large number of Chouans attacked a tumulus called Saint-Michel and captured that. For anyone who knows the area, the one important thing to remember is that anywhere in that area, whole area, in the peninsula, etc., there were almost no trees. So all the trees you see today, there would be just plain flat land. So the tumulus, for instance, was much more remarkable feature of the landscape. So those Republicans quickly retreated, fled really, I suppose is a better way of putting it. Some were killed and 7 were taken prisoner. 3 of those were almost immediately shot by the Chouans. And the rest were only spared actually by the intervention of the emigres. So it was the introduction to the new arrivals of the warfare that was taking place and the violence of the insurrection. As a representation of a Chouan, when the landing took place, they were joined by lots of local Bretons, Chouan leaders, and it's worth quoting this from Warren when he's writing back to London. I am busy disembarking all the residue of the stores for the troops. I have already armed between 3,000 and 4,000 royalists, by Breton royalists, and the numbers that come down to join us are inconceivable. I never saw so affecting a scene as the reception of the troops by our friends. Old men and young cried, and men, women and children brought butter, eggs, milk, bread, wine, and whatever they had, both to our people and the troops, and would not receive a farthing in payment. I think I better get some water. The following day, he estimated that between 10 and 12,000 muskets had already been distributed. He even described the beach resembles a fair. There was a bit of a problem here because Overley was not very pleased with the way things were being distributed. Essentially, he felt they were just being handed out to anyone, whether they were going to be useful or not. Just seemed to go, anyone who turned up could have a musket. They were being fired in the air, fired all over the place. So he actually withdrew his troops and kept them separate. And this became another little niggle, or worse, between the two men, Puisset and Overley. And also the emigre officers and troops were starting to think, hang on, what's going wrong? You know, what's going on here? We are here to supply these a force that is active, that is already a threat to the Republican. And as one wrote, we expected to find a force at least in the process of organisation, and our disappointment was great at the appearance of these undisciplined crowds. And even Warren, who was actually really sympathetic to the local Breton population, he said, if any unforeseen bad luck should ensue, our number of troops are too small to resist the best forces that the convention will undoubtedly assemble against us. And he felt that the Chouans just could not and would not stand up in a set-piece battle, as it were. But Puisset really wanted to push on with this advance into Brittany, his sort of dream of attacking Rennes, taking that, and then creating the whole province of Brittany as almost like a fortress from which, in the following year, a huge counter-revolutionary force would advance on Paris, with him obviously in the front. Meanwhile, the Republican troops retreated to the nearby town of Auray and then evacuated that town, and then headed to what is now the departmental capital of Vannes. So the Royalists controlled an area of about 300 square kilometres, and the only nearby troops were about the 700 or so that were actually stuck in Quiberon Bay. Hoche arrived at Vannes. He immediately got the Republicans mobilised and called for reinforcements from everywhere nearby. So by the 8th of July, there were well over 22,000 Republican troops were either in and around Morbihan or were on their way. He really galvanised the response. But even before that, on the 28th of June, Hoche had 2,000 men at Vannes, and so he began to advance on Auray, which he entered 2 days later. So already this Royalist perimeter was being squeezed. The perimeter was largely being held by these armed Chouans who had been armed at the beaches. The soldiers were kept, by and large, for any proper special measures and special purposes, or as a reserve, and certainly that was the idea. So, as the perimeter sort of started collapsing, the question was, where were these Royalist troops? Well, they were going to be used to capture Quiberon, and Quiberon Peninsula. The reason, because Carnac couldn't provide a defensive position. And also, please excuse this map, they're much better matches in the book, but I couldn't get those out to do those. This is a map of Quiberon Peninsula. Up towards the west coast is called the Côte Sauvage, because it's open to the Atlantic. But on the east coast, there are two small ports, one up towards the north, now it's marked Saint-Pierre, and another port further down, just to the, you can see the mark of the marina now there, just there, on there. And it was called the Port d'Orange, it's the one on the north, and Port Alaguin on further south. So these ports the idea was these ports could be used, and they were used, for bringing even more supplies to for the insurrection in Brittany. But the other thing was, the entrance to Quiberon is marked by a fort called Fort Pontièvre. I'll show a picture in a minute of that. And the whole idea was that this Quiberon Peninsula should be the source and the proper depot where all the new Breton troops would be trained properly, equipped properly, and then sent out and used for the greater counter-revolution. That's the fort today. I reinforce it today because most of those works are in actual fact from later on in the 19th century. The only area that's sort of probably contemporary is the gate. You can see the apparatus for climbing, the wires. Immediately to the right hand of those is that gatehouse or gate area. That's probably the only contemporary part of it. Also, sorry. Also, it's got to be said that the isthmus joining the peninsula to the mainland, certainly at this point, was much wider. Where to the, as you look at it, the left side of the fort, nowadays there's a road and a railway, which has actually stabilised the sand. At the time of the 1795, the sand would extend almost to the far side of the cliff, as you see it. But also, what was called the fort was much larger, and later on I'll show you an imaginative representation of what the fort might look like. So for the attack in the morning of the 30th of June, the coastal batteries on Quiberon Peninsula and the fort were bombarded by British ships for about 4 hours. An attack by land and sea was then prepared for the following morning, but bad weather prevented that, and so certainly prevented the naval operation, and so the military operation was called off. So the weather only improved on the night of the 2nd and 3rd of July. And early in the morning, small boats of all descriptions set off from the shore near Carnac, and then with the frigates and the gun vessels, British Navy gun vessels, covering the coastal batteries, a force of 2,000 Chouans, 250 men of the loyal emigrants, 100 of Hector, and 150 Marines from the British warships headed towards the peninsula. I say Marines like that because most of them were actually British line infantry regiments, soldiers acting as Marines, because there were short of Marines at the time. But despite expectations, no one fired at them. So when they landed at about 5 o'clock in the morning, just south of Port d'Orange, there was a detachment of Republican troops on the beach. They were from the 41st line, which before the revolution was the Régiment de la Reine. And a loyal emigrant captain summoned their commander to surrender, which he immediately did, and then came over and helped the loyal emigrant officer out of the boat. They'd both been comrades in the same regiment before the revolution. But simultaneously, the men of the Overley and Dresnay had marched down the isthmus, accompanied by artillery and about 600 Chouans. So coming within the range of the forts, they summoned the garrison to surrender. And it sounds like they were spooked by the signal for the landing, which was a cannon going off, and then immediately capitulated. Puissy was not very happy that Hervely took the capitulation. He wanted to be the man to do that. And actually, when he turned up, he was very upset and changed lots of arrangements. But he did make sure that alongside the white French royal flag, a British flag was flown alongside, which later that evening Warren tactfully took down the British flag. Because the whole point was they wanted any place that was taken to go and be taken by the French monarchists for the King of France. And immediately afterwards, about half of the Republican soldiers volunteered to join the émigré regiments. Two-thirds of the men of the 41st line did that. Immediately, there was work to improve the defences of the fort. Sorry, can I just, how am I doing for time?
Perhaps just about another 5 minutes or so, just to sort of get posh onto the peninsula.
Okay, about only 5, yeah?
Well, so 5, 6 minutes, yeah.
Okay.
3 to half past.
All right, okay. I will try and rattle on. Sorry, I didn't have my timing on that. By that time, I better quickly get on them. This is a picture of the isthmus with a beach on the out to the Atlantic side, the west coast, but it shows something that the isthmus looked like. Well, so what is important is that it is actually, although you'd think, oh, a sandy isthmus with a bit of heatherets or short grass on it would be quite flat. In actual fact, there's quite deep and marked areas that meant that even soldiers, even on horses, could be hidden from view. On the 6th of July, the whole perimeter had collapsed. Carnac, the Hoche was in Carnac, and so crowds of Breton civilians headed towards Quiberon. And as the Republicans advanced behind them, there was even a chance that they, as the Bretons climbed over the outworks to get past the Fort Pontièvre, that the Republicans would just follow on behind them. So, as a result, on the 7th of July, Hoche was able to write back to Paris, "The Anglo-émigrés Chouans are like rats trapped in Quiberon, where the army keeps them blockaded. I hope in a few days we will be free of them." I mean, there was lots of different activities at the same time. There was some naval activities going on, and through the next following days, the Royalists did try and harass the Republicans who were building up defences on the far end, the northern end of the isthmus. The defences that were created by the Republicans now were largely marked by the remains from Hitler's Atlantic Wall, hence the watchtower or artillery spotting tower that is there. But what's interesting is that for both purposes in different centuries, that the same site was seen as useful. In particular, it cut off. What it meant was that it was a line across, was constructed across the north part of the isthmus, which meant that at low tide, no one could get past that position. So if anyone who's familiar with the area, the actual gulf between the peninsula and the mainland extended much further north than the current road and railway is now. There was a bit of a problem. Puissy thought, well, what are we going to do? And according to his own account, some Shuan leaders, including Cadwdal, came up to him on the 9th of July and came up with a plan that if they were to land in the mainland, they could be able to come round and take the Republican position in the rear. So Puisay, again by his own account, rushes to see Overley and says, and this is quote, "We will get out of here," I said to him. "If you work with me, I will have Hoche attacked on his rear by 20,000 men on an appointed day. At the same time, we will attack him from the front, and all will be put right. The fate of the expedition is again in your hands." And to this proposition, Overley ceded to his military inclinations, and he consented to all. The appointed day and time was daybreak on the 16th of July. And so one body of about 3,500 Shuan, with some men from the loyal emigrants, were landed far to the east at a place called Sarzay, which is near on the east side of Morbihan Bay. And they then set off to march round Van with the idea that they would come to the back of the French position on the isthmus, on the north part of the isthmus, at a place called Sainte-Barbe. Another body was meant to be landed after them, either to create more havoc or not, about 3,000, but they ended up being landed west of Lorient. It's got to be said that probably not a great deal was expected from the second party. But then simultaneously, ships carrying the second division arrived that had reached Spithead off Portsmouth on the 5th of July. They arrived on the 15th of July. And they actually came into Morbihan Bay that evening of the 15th of July, so the evening before the attack. Overley is portrayed as driving forward and saying, we've got to make this attack. But even if you take Puisay's account, he's saying that his Shuan are going to be attacking in the early hours of the 16th at the rear, so hence the émigré troops had to attack the Republican positions that night or that early morning to coincide.
Alistair, I think
yes?
probably we need to be rounding.
Okay, all right. I'll cut a long story short. The attack failed. The Shuan never appeared. That's big question is, why didn't they appear? Puisay gives a very long extended that it was his rival royalists that had plotted it, etc. I would contend, that's a load of rubbish. And that actually what he was trying to do was recreate his plan of landing on the north coast of Brittany, because that's where those Shuan headed. It was a bloody repulse. Overley was mortally wounded. He got a Biscayan shot about that size in his stomach, and he lived till November in great pain to die. They retreated in a chaos back to Fort Pontieva. Although the Republicans didn't make any further advance on that occasion, the morale collapsed. So reconstruction of the troops after their retreat. Overley in the front, some Shuan in the middle, and the two emigrants, and Hector on the left-hand side. This is an imaginative sort of reconstruction of what the fort might have looked at that time. There is a map plan in the British Library as well that actually gives a much better representation of what it would really look like, and there is a interpretation in there.
That's in the south of the...
That's in the north. That's facing south.
Facing south.
South, yes. Second Division arrived. The plan was, because the First Division was in such disorganisation, they should hold the fort. Puissy says no, and so there was a compromise. The garrison should be a few detachments from the Second Division, and the rest of Hervey's regiment would hold. On the 20th of June, there were about 2,500 troops in the peninsula, with 5,300 Bretons, men, women and children. The Republicans had about 12,500 at their position by then. That night, in a terrible storm, the Republicans advanced on the fort. They'd been told the password for get past the forward post by deserters. Nevertheless, they didn't get into the fort, or the frontal attack did not get into the fort. Just as it was falling into confusion, a feint attack, or an additional attack, climbed the cliff and got round to the side of the fort. Whether they got in and then were joined by men from the Hervey who changed sides, or they were helped in, is a question. But obviously once they started shooting on their comrades, chaos ensued, and the Republicans, who were about to retreat, headed into the fort. The Second Division, that had been housed further south, had hardly any ammunition. By the time they got up there, it was over. There was a withdrawal down into high ground in the centre, led by General Sombrel, or Colonel Sombrel, who was commander of the Second Division. He went to Puissy to try and get some instructions. Puissy told him to hold the high ground, and that's the last they saw of Puissy. He headed off to the British ships. Sombrel in the end found he couldn't hold there, so he headed to a small coastal battery called Fort Neuf, which is down just south of the Port Alaguin. It was just a little coastal battery. By that time, the emigres troops had no run out of ammunition. The British Navy gun vessel, Pelter, good name for them, tried to support them. And there's controversy. Did Sombrel capitulate? Did Hoche take the surrender or not? Unlikely, because the law stated that any emigre found with arms would be killed. Nevertheless, the Royalists believed it. In the end, they did surrender, and the numbers, so that Hoche reported 6,262 prisoners of various descriptions, and the emigres were separated, and in the end, 713 prisoners were shot. As for the Shoah, the majority of the prisoners, typhus hit the prisons, and 400 of them died. And then the rest were released in one way or another. As for the soldiers of the Royalist regiments, 2,848 were, quote, acquitted and incorporated into various battalions of the Army and Navy. All I'd say is it goes on after that. That wasn't the end of it. So really there are expeditions, because a further Warren stayed in the bay just before he was about to go on the 10th of September. A huge convoy arrived with French troops, the Comte d'Artois, who was the heir to the throne, and it was only on the 26th of December did the final British ships leave the bay. that's another story. Sorry about the timing. I apologise.
Okay, we have some questions, but just before we do, can I just show of hands, how many people have been to Quiberon? Yeah, I thought it'd be quite a lot. How many people have sailed in the Gulf of Morbihan? Yeah, I thought it'd be quite a lot. Okay, so if you haven't been to Quiberon, then everything that's been described by Alistair you can trace, because there are plaques all around the peninsula which highlight where various actions took place. So you can follow, it's basically it's a tribute to Hoche. You can follow Hoche and his troops' progress down through the peninsula. And the other thing is, of course, is that those of you who've been there and have been in the marketplace in Quiberon itself will know that there is a very imposing statue of General Hoche, who, if I'm right in thinking, died only a year or two later. He had tuberculosis. But he's the man who almost conquered Ireland, but that's another story.
The one thing I would say about Hoche is why it's particularly interesting is because he died so young. He was never an opponent or a rival to Napoleon, so his memory is still burnished.
Yes.
Yeah.
And he had great hair. What's right? If we have any questions,
Can I've got the mic and I'm going to ask the first one.
Right.
Why did they leave from Lymington?
Right, because under the Act of Parliament, they could only be, bear with me, 20 miles from the coast. They could not go any closer to London. You've got to remember the hostility of Parliament against troops, royal troops, particularly foreign troops, to the power of Parliament. It's back to the English Civil War.
Right, okay. Any questions?
Mr. Nichols, isn't it the case that after all this was over, only 6 French troops got back to Lymington where they started?
I don't know the exact... Sorry,
those
sir.
6 are buried in St Thomas Church here. You know that one?
No, I don't know.
The other thing I'd like to mention, to do with the museum, founded by a guy called Ted Marsh. Many of us will know that name. Now, Ted Marsh and his wife did a tour of the Brittany Peninsula and followed this expedition and found a private museum in a town that escapes me name at the minute. But Carnac, yes, thank you. There's a small private museum in that town which features this entire expedition.
Mm-hmm.
He met the curator of the museum, who presented him with a portrait of Count Hector, who was the officer in command of the Lymington people. Mm-hmm. Now that painting is somewhere in our archives, even today.
Yeah. We have an expert here on the collection.
I think the painting that you're talking about is, there is a museum of the Chouin at just actually built into an old bunker, a German bunker, in what was the lines.
Yeah.
And when I mentioned the historian who described how the Vendéans were treated, is Scherer is his surname, described it as the French genocide. He is the founder of that museum.
I think it should be said about the museums, by the way, that they're very interesting, but they're not particularly well maintained. They're not of the standard of some baths. Like
No. Yeah.
Yeah, you said only 6 came back. I thought that we got 12, 1,300.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, bear with me. Warren was to write and say, sorry, I've got the numbers. 6,000. Ah, yeah, here we are. Sorry, here.
There's just a question about how many people got back.
Well, certainly 1,000 troops and 1,400 Shuar reached the British ships that day. And many, many more of them were launches, British launches, although Chasse-Marée would pick them off the shore and bring them back. The loyal emigrants were expanded, and that's the regiment that came back to Lymington in particular. And ended up being, then that regiment went on to...
That's essentially the French people that came from France originally.
Yes.
But what happened to the British people that were caught? Were they killed? Were they sent back?
No, there were hardly any British on Quiberon at the time of the attack. There was at least one naval surgeon, and there was a ordnance board staff member. They certainly were there. Originally, it was thought there were none, but they were definitely there. But there were no British combatants at that time.
Perhaps time's fast, but we'll just take 2 more questions, because I'm afraid he's got a microphone at the back as well.
Excuse me. What happened to that awful con man, Poussin?
Puissy.
Did you ever Poussin? Yes.
Puissy. He came back to Britain. He did okay, I think, in many ways. He tried to found an émigré settlement in Canada. That didn't work out very well. And he came back to London, and I think, I'm sorry, bear with me. He died in London. Yeah, can't remember. I think, was he murdered?
In 1827.
But murdered by a servant, wasn't it, or something like that?
I don't know.
I think like that. I can't.
Yeah. One last question.
question.
Anybody got a question?
Was there a gentleman over here? I sound like I'm running an auction.
Yeah.
No?
Was there involvement from the Hessians? Were the Hessians involved?
Not directly. At one stage, a few thousand did join a reserve British force that was on the south coast, and they were housed at Lymington. Sorry, not at Lymington. Sorry, the Isle of Wight. Sorry about that. But they then ended up going back to the mainland Europe. Yes.
This was a question about German troops operating under British auspices because of historic links across the 18th century between Georgian England and the German states. Yeah, is that right?
No, they were under contract. The Hessians were under contract. Hanoverians, as the the Hessians were actually under contract.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that was great, and I'm sure. Well, I certainly learnt a lot, and I hope all of you did as well. And it's something Lymington can be proud of. We have this sort of, military connection, which not enough people probably know about. But at least we know a little bit more now, thanks to Alistair. So we should express our appreciation in the usual way. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll just say about what I was saying is that there's 25% off if you order your book through Hellion Limited Books. That lasts until the end of this month. And within that, there is a lot more. In particular, if you do visit or know Quiberon, each of the places, both sides of the channel, are mentioned. Lymington, Nursling Common, Netley, camp, lots and lots of places were all around
Lots
here.
of familiar places.
Yeah.
So the next meeting, as Jackie said, is in June, on the 20th of June. It's Mark Highway talking about the RAF at Ore Point during the Second World War. Look forward to seeing you then. Thank you very much. That's great. Thanks, Alistair. Thank you.